I'll have those speed bumps removed immediately.
Yes!
Not without the entire board agreeing.
The first plume of smoke drifted lazily across the cul-de-sac, carrying the savory scent of sizzling brisket and marinated vegetables. I noticed Heather Whitmore standing rigidly at the edge of her perfectly manicured lawn, clipboard clutched like a weapon, her eyes narrowed, lips pressed into a thin line. "This is a violation," she declared, her voice slicing through the Saturday morning calm. "That smoke could be classified as a nuisance. I could issue a formal complaint." The board chair didn't need to finish. Her menace hung heavy in the air. I set the tongs down deliberately, letting the hiss of the grill fill the silence. "Heather, that's not how the bylaws define nuisance," I replied, calm but firm. "These sensors I installed measure only actual hazards, not harmless barbecue smoke." The enforcer in crimson stiffened, a faint flicker of disbelief crossing her otherwise rigid expression. She opened her mouth to argue, but I cut in, my tone soft yet deliberate. "This easement is mine, and it complies with every regulation. If you've ever felt that cold thrill of knowing you hold leverage over someone who believes in unchecked authority, that was the moment. So, hit subscribe right now." The clipboard queen paused, shifting her weight, realizing I wasn't merely a resident. I was someone who understood the rules, who had mastery over the very regulations she pretended to enforce. I leaned slightly against the grill, inhaling the aroma of hickory and cedar chips, grounding myself in the ritual that had connected me to this neighborhood for years. "I've spent decades ensuring this street's safety and fairness," I continued, voice low, controlled. "My barbecues are more than meals. They're community gatherings, moments of connection." The tyrant in heels glared, clearly frustrated that her authority was being undermined by routine civility and adherence to law rather than confrontation. The air shifted as the neighbors peeked from windows and porches, curious eyes taking in the unfolding drama. Their expressions were cautious, intrigued. They weren't intruding. They were witnesses to the power struggle. I let them see the calm resolve I carried, a stark contrast to Heather Whitmore, the officer of rules, whose frown deepened as her overreach became evident. "This isn't just about smoke," I added, gesturing subtly toward my son's treehouse and the community garden in the background. "It's about respect, fairness, and the right to enjoy our own property. Every plant, every path, every ramp I've built is protected under these rules, and you know it." The board chair's fingers tightened around her clipboard. She realized that this battle wasn't a petty spat. It was public, deliberate, and grounded in law. I paused, letting the statement hang like a challenge. "Where are you watching from?" I asked casually, directing the question at the observing neighbors. A simple phrase, but it invited solidarity without forcing confrontation. The enforcer in crimson bristled, the clipboard queen's jaw tensed. Her authority was being witnessed, questioned, and subtly undermined. The grill hissed, the smoke curled higher, and the cul-de-sac felt charged, suspended between aroma, tension, and anticipation. Each footstep, each glance mattered. The tyrant in heels couldn't ignore the evidence of my preparation. The sensors, the legal knowledge, the calm patience. Every neighbor could see the contrast, her fury versus my deliberate composure. Heather Whitmore, standing rigid and fuming, embodied every form of petty authority. The board chair, the enforcer in crimson, the clipboard queen, the tyrant in heels, the officer of rules. And yet, she was being outmaneuvered not with anger, but with preparation, transparency, and calm defiance. The first victory was mine, quiet, undeniable, and witnessed. The cul-de-sac had gone silent, as if holding its breath after the morning confrontation. Heather Whitmore, the board chair, lingered near the edge of my property, her posture stiff, clipboard still in hand. The enforcer in crimson scanned the yard, clearly calculating her next move. I could see the gears turning behind her eyes, the anticipation of confrontation almost palpable. She was relentless, driven by habit, ego, and the illusion of authority. But her control was tenuous, fragile. Neighbors peeked from windows, murmuring quietly to each other. They'd witnessed the first clash, and now curiosity mixed with cautious optimism. The clipboard queen made a small, deliberate step forward, inspecting my smoke detectors and the sensors I had installed. She furrowed her brow, as though trying to reconcile her assumptions with reality. Every footstep of hers betrayed hesitation. The tyrant in heels was realizing this wasn't a casual warning. This was a calculated counter to her arbitrary power. "I've reviewed every bylaw, every regulation," I said, keeping my voice calm but precise, letting the gravity of the situation resonate. "This smoke, this barbecue, it's entirely compliant. I suggest you reconsider before escalating this further." The officer of rules, Heather Whitmore, stiffened, a faint blush creeping across her cheeks, part indignation, part unease. Her words were sharp but faltered. I can issue fines, enforce penalties." Her voice betrayed her uncertainty, betraying the cracks in her authoritarian facade. I pivoted slightly, letting my gaze sweep across the observing neighbors. Their expressions were tentative, yet a quiet energy was forming. I didn't need to raise my voice. The presence of witnesses amplified the weight of every decision. The board chair noticed the shift, her eyes narrowing as she realized public opinion was now a silent participant in this struggle. The enforcer in crimson tightened her grip on the clipboard, but I had already anticipated the gesture. It was merely a symbol of performative authority. "I've invited everyone to witness transparency and fairness," I added, gesturing subtly to the line of homes visible from my patio. "We can handle this properly, or we can escalate unnecessarily. The choice is yours." The clipboard queen's lips pressed thin. She didn't reply immediately, calculating the optics of continuing the dispute against an organized, evidence-backed resident. The tyrant in heels realized her habitual intimidation tactics were ineffective here. My calm resolve nullified the usual chaos she thrived on. Across the street, a few neighbors nodded to each other, whispering quietly, sharing knowing glances. Even without direct intervention, their presence became leverage. The officer of rules shifted uneasily, understanding that the perception of fairness mattered as much as the technicalities of the bylaws. Her aura of dominance was being undermined not by anger, but by structure, transparency, and community cohesion. "Carter, excuse me," Heather Whitmore began, her tone slightly faltering. "Even if technically compliant, the smoke—" I cut in gently, using her own language to redirect her. "Technically compliant, observed by neighbors, documented, and within all allowances. You have a choice. Uphold the bylaws accurately, or expose yourself as overreaching again." The board chair's jaw tightened, her power threatened not by argument, but by clarity and collective observation. The cul-de-sac remained tense, yet there was a growing undercurrent of support around me. Every glance from the neighbors, every hesitant step by Heather Whitmore, reinforced a truth she couldn't ignore. Authority unchecked by procedure, witness, and evidence was vulnerable. The enforcer in crimson, the clipboard queen, the tyrant in heels, the officer of rules, each iteration of Heather Whitmore was present, yet powerless against methodical preparation. As the morning sun crested, the weight of public accountability pressed down. Heather Whitmore lingered, uncertain, her usual poise replaced by calculated hesitation. I could feel the tide turning, not by confrontation, but by quiet, deliberate preparation. The community was watching, and they were ready to notice everything. The tension didn't dissipate with the morning sun. It thickened like the smoke still curling from the barbecue pit. Heather Whitmore, the board chair, hovered at the edge of my property again, scanning the scene with calculated scrutiny. The enforcer in crimson's eyes flicked between the sensors I had installed, and the neighbors cautiously watching from their porches. She was studying patterns, as though trying to decode a puzzle that refused to be solved. Every micro-movement, the clipboard queen's finger tapping the sheet, the tyrant in heels' slight tilt of the head, the officer of rules' tightened jaw, spoke volumes about her mental state, measured uncertainty, irritation, and a flicker of doubt. Through the side window, I noticed Mrs. Langley, our conflicted witness, standing just inside her doorway. Her arms were crossed tightly, a small tremor in her fingers betraying her inner turmoil. She had witnessed Heather Whitmore overstep countless times, yet her loyalty, or fear, kept her silent. I'd seen her glance toward the neighbors, her eyes darting back at the clipboard queen, as if weighing consequences. The enforcer in crimson hadn't noticed, too wrapped in her own ritual of intimidation. Yet I could sense the subtle shift, the moment when internal conflict began, its quiet but inevitable crescendo. Heather Whitmore's voice cut through the morning air, clipped and precise. Even with precautions, smoke wafts into other yards. It's a violation. Her tone was polished, a practiced cadence designed to command compliance. But the board chair's confidence was beginning to fray at the edges. I remained calm, letting the collective observation of neighbors amplify the weight of every word. The clipboard queen's usual weapons, threats, fines, and bureaucratic posturing, felt hollow here. The tyrant in heels was no longer dictating the narrative. I was merely letting the truth unfold. I stepped forward slightly, showing my documentation calmly but deliberately. Every censor, every guideline, every bylaw was followed. This is a lawful barbecue, observed by multiple neighbors within all parameters. You can proceed incorrectly, or you can acknowledge reality. The officer of rules shifted uncomfortably, realizing that the more she attempted to assert dominance, the more vulnerable she appeared. The enforcer in crimson hesitated, her gaze flicking toward Mrs. Langley, who now twitched with visible indecision. Inside her house, the conflicted witness sighed softly, her body swaying just slightly as she wrestled with the choice between loyalty and morality. The tension etched across her features was unmistakable. The quiet shaking of her shoulders betrayed a storm of internal arguments. Was it worth maintaining allegiance to Heather Whitmore, the board chair she had once respected? Or was it time to side with reason, fairness, and the rules themselves? The clipboard queen had overlooked her, but I noticed every subtle sign, every micro-expression. Heather Whitmore, sensing the shift, attempted a thin smile, a display of unshaken authority. We maintain property standards for everyone. This is a matter of community integrity. But the tyrant in heels' usual certainty faltered as a few neighbors nodded subtly, their murmurs of quiet agreement growing louder behind closed curtains. Even the officer of rules could sense that perception now equaled power, and the scales were tipping. The conflicted witness finally took a hesitant step forward, shifting weight from one foot to another. Her eyes met mine. A silent plea mingled with fear. The enforcer in crimson frowned, realizing she might lose an ally. Heather Whitmore's face tightened, the board chair realizing that control could never be absolute when doubt had infiltrated the ranks. The clipboard queen's fingers lingered over the papers, indecision creeping into every deliberate motion. It was subtle, almost invisible to the untrained eye, yet it mattered profoundly. The community was awakening, the witness beginning to act, and Heather Whitmore, the tyrant in heels, was realizing that the rules she wielded as weapons could also wield consequences against her. Every measured step, every careful glance, every hesitant movement was building momentum for the coming storm. The air felt heavier that morning, almost electric with anticipation. Heather Whitmore, the board chair, appeared at the edge of my driveway, her silhouette sharp and deliberate. The enforcer in crimson's gaze swept the property, calculating angles, weighing potential violations. Even the clipboard queen, usually so composed, seemed tense, her pen hovering over the forms as if indecision had taken hold. The tyrant in heels shifted slightly, tapping her foot, a subtle rhythm betraying frustration. The officer of rules remained motionless, observing everything with quiet scrutiny, as if preparing to report every perceived misstep. I stepped out onto the porch, letting the smell of the barbecue mingle with the crisp morning air. The neighbors were gathering, curiosity evident in their cautious smiles and whispered conversations. Heather Whitmore's eyes narrowed, noticing the growing crowd, the unspoken alliance forming among those she had long sought to control. She cleared her throat, projecting authority, yet the board chair's usual certainty was beginning to waver. Even with precautions, the smoke from your grill infringes on other properties, the enforcer in crimson stated, her voice deliberate, every word designed to intimidate. This constitutes a nuisance violation, effective immediately. The clipboard queen flipped through her papers, confirming regulations she had likely misinterpreted, reinforcing Heather Whitmore's assertion with bureaucratic precision. The tyrant in heels stepped forward, her shadow stretching across the walkway, a visual declaration of dominance. But the officer of rules, despite her poised demeanor, hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. I raised a hand calmly, letting the moment stretch. All guidelines have been followed, every sensor installed, every precaution taken. This is within legal and HOA parameters. You can assert authority incorrectly, or acknowledge the facts, I said, my voice steady but firm. The crowd shifted, sensing the tension, their murmurs of quiet agreement growing louder behind the fences and behind closed curtains. Heather Whitmore's expression tightened, the board chair recognizing that her presence alone no longer commanded. Automatic obedience. The enforcer in crimson glanced at the neighbors, their subtle nods undermining the threats she had counted on. The clipboard queen's pen hovered, unsure if her notes would support an already fragile argument. The tyrant in heels tilted her head, reconsidering her approach as the officer of rule's quiet observation threatened to expose procedural weaknesses. Inside her house, the conflicted witness watched, a mixture of fear and resolve crossing her face. The micro-expressions, the small tightening of her shoulders, the hesitant footstep, it all indicated the internal struggle reaching a tipping point. Could she finally step away from loyalty to Heather Whitmore, the enforcer in crimson, and side with fairness? Each second stretched, a quiet battle raging behind her eyes. Heather Whitmore, sensing resistance, tried a thin smile, a veneer of control. Rules are rules. Community integrity must be maintained, the board chair declared, but even her voice lacked its usual conviction. The clipboard queen's fingers tapped nervously on the paperwork, betraying indecision. The tyrant in heels adjusted her stance, realizing that commanding obedience was no longer sufficient when doubt had infiltrated the ranks. I took another slow step forward, the calm in my posture serving as contrast to the tension vibrating through Heather Whitmore's body. The neighbors leaned subtly closer, sensing a shift, as though the balance of authority was quietly tipping. The officer of rule's eyes flicked between the board chair and myself, noting every procedural misstep, every moment of hesitation. The enforcer in crimson's jaw tightened, acknowledging the rising threat to her dominance. And beneath it all, the conflicted witness finally moved, a subtle but significant gesture, her decision crystallizing. The clipboard queen noticed, the tyrant in heels stiffened, and Heather Whitmore's aura of absolute control faltered for the first time. The morning's confrontation, once a simple assertion of power, had become a chessboard of observation, strategy, and emerging alliances. The sun had climbed higher, but the tension in the neighborhood had thickened like smoke from my grill. Heather Whitmore, the board chair, arrived with deliberate steps, her heels clicking sharply against the sidewalk. The enforcer in crimson hovered near the edge of the driveway, scanning for any infractions that could be leveraged. The clipboard queen's papers rustled under her hand, notes meticulously aligned, yet betraying subtle hesitation. The tyrant in heels adjusted her stance, shadows stretching over the freshly raked grass, asserting dominance without words. The officer of rules lingered behind them, eyes calculating, registering each neighbor's expression and my own calm stance. "You cannot continue to ignore repeated violations," the board chair stated, her voice tight with authority. Heather Whitmore's expression was firm, but the calm, confidence I projected seemed to challenge her control. The enforcer in crimson stepped closer, scanning the property for more than smoke, searching for pretexts, loopholes, any reason to assert power. The clipboard queen flipped pages rapidly, as though the answers lay in ink, but her fingers trembled slightly. Even the tyrant in heels appeared unsettled, the practiced poise faltering under the weight of eyes watching closely. I remained on the porch, arms folded, observing. Every precaution has been taken. No rules have been broken, every measurement, every guideline verified, I said, letting my words settle. Heather Whitmore's jaw tightened, the board chair suddenly aware that her authority relied as much on perception as procedure. The enforcer in crimson fidgeted, the clipboard queen glanced at her, and the officer of rule's eyes flickered toward them, as if silently judging procedural integrity. The conflicted witness peered from the fence line, her hands twisting subtly, signaling a struggle. She had seen the arbitrary power Heather Whitmore exerted, felt the subtle coercion, and now the cracks were appearing. Her hesitation was no longer just internal. It was poised on the precipice of action. I could sense it, the slight shift of weight, a breath held, a movement almost imperceptible, but meaningful. The tension built, a silent countdown before the first decisive motion. Heather Whitmore, sensing resistance, attempted a display of control. "I will not allow you to circumvent the rules," the board chair stated, pointing toward the speed bumps I had installed. The enforcer in crimson nodded sharply, reinforcing the threat. The clipboard queen's pen hovered, the tyrant in heels tapped a rhythmless beat, and the officer of rules' gaze sharpened, documenting and weighing. I stepped down from the porch, letting my presence carry calm authority. Circumvention? No. Compliance? Legal, within HOA parameters, and safely executed. If your concern is for safety, you'll find every measure accounted for, I said. The neighbors shifted subtly, murmuring in quiet support, emboldened by my steady tone. Heather Whitmore's face tightened, realizing that intimidation alone could no longer silence dissent. The board chair's hands tightened around a folded notice, ready to escalate, but the officer of rules' quiet observation hinted at procedural flaws in Heather Whitmore's strategy. The clipboard queen's pen stuttered midair. The tyrant in heel's confident posture began to falter. Even the enforcer in crimson, whose gaze had been unyielding, flicked to her side, noticing the ripple effect among the neighbors. Beneath the tension, the conflicted witness finally moved, a subtle step forward, a glance toward me that spoke volumes. The board chair noticed, her authority quietly challenged. Heather Whitmore's aura of command, usually so absolute, wavered. The morning had shifted from routine enforcement to a strategic standoff where perception, procedure, and unity of purpose became the silent weapons. The neighborhood, once divided, now sensed a subtle change. The power balance was tipping. The air was heavy with anticipation, as though the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. Heather Whitmore, the board chair, emerged from the shadows of her SUV, clipboard clutched tightly. The enforcer in crimson followed closely, heels striking the pavement in a rhythm of authority. The clipboard queen adjusted her papers with a meticulous precision, scanning the property as if every detail could be twisted into justification. The tyrant in heels paused, surveying the block like a general calculating her next maneuver. The officer of rules hovered nearby, silently observing, cataloging, ready to validate any infringement she could cite. "You think these installations are safe? You think you can override HOA judgment?" Heather Whitmore demanded, voice cutting through the morning calm. Her tone carried the weight of arrogance, the board chair projecting power with every word. The enforcer in crimson nodded sharply, reinforcing the threat. The clipboard queen's pen hovered indecisively. The tyrant in heels tapped a heel impatiently, and the officer of rules' eyes swept across the scene, noting every neighbor watching silently. I stepped forward, letting my posture and tone carry the calm confidence that came from experience. Every precaution has been measured. Every legal guideline followed. The speed bumps serve a safety purpose, not an act of defiance, I stated. The words, simple yet firm, seemed to ripple through the immediate crowd. Heather Whitmore's jaw clenched, the board chair momentarily realizing that procedural knowledge was now a weapon against her arbitrary authority. The conflicted witness lingered near the mailbox, glancing between us. Her hands twitched, betraying the internal struggle. She had seen the overreach of Heather Whitmore, the enforcer in crimson's rigidity, and the clipboard queen's anxious oversight. Now, something in the calm logic I displayed gave her pause, a small spark of courage against the tyranny she had long witnessed. Her slight step forward was subtle, but it changed the dynamic in a way that was immediately felt by all present. Heather Whitmore, sensing the shift, tried to reclaim dominance. "This is not just a safety issue, it's a matter of control and precedent. You cannot set these standards independently," the board chair asserted, fingers pressing firmly against the clipboard. The enforcer in crimson gestured sharply toward the speed bumps, reinforcing the threat. The tyrant in heels' stance stiffened, while the officer of rules scribbled notes with exacting attention. I let the morning air carry my response. Control is irrelevant when the community's well-being is at stake. Every installation aligns with municipal guidelines and HOA requirements. You may enforce rules, but you cannot rewrite safety standards arbitrarily. My words held a quiet authority, unshakable, the calm of a firefighter accustomed to assessing risk under pressure. The clipboard queen flinched slightly, the enforcer in crimson's frown deepened, and the tyrant in heels shifted weight, realizing her usual intimidation held less sway. Neighbors began to murmur softly, glances exchanged, subtle nods of recognition that the balance of influence was tilting. Even the conflicted witness's faint smile signaled a shift, a readiness to act, to support the truth quietly but decisively. Heather Whitmore's aura of unchallengeable authority wavered, the board chair suddenly confronted by the procedural and moral clarity she could not easily dismiss. The morning standoff had transformed into a subtle, strategic chess match. Every step I took, Every calm word spoken was positioning. Heather Whitmore, the enforcer in crimson, the clipboard queen, the tyrant in heels, and the officer of rules, each observed, calculated, adjusted, yet none could break the foundation of lawfulness and preparation that now strengthened the community. The stage was set. The game had moved from a simple argument over speed bumps to a demonstration of procedural mastery and community alignment. Heather Whitmore's control was being challenged not by chaos, but by preparation, evidence, and calm defiance. The neighborhood, once silent in fear, now leaned into a new rhythm of possibility. The air felt charged, like the calm before a storm. Heather Whitmore, the board chair, approached with measured steps, her gaze sharp, assessing every inch of the speed bumps. The enforcer in crimson flanked her, heels clicking against the pavement in a rhythm meant to intimidate. The clipboard queen's fingers danced over her papers, double-checking every detail with a careful rigidity. The tyrant in heels held her posture stiff, projecting dominance, while the officer of rules observed silently, pen poised, ready to validate any transgression. I watched them approach, maintaining my composure, every movement calculated, every word ready to convey calm authority. "Good morning," I said lightly, letting my tone carry confidence instead of anger. Heather Whitmore's eyes narrowed. The board chair's lips pressed tight, a silent challenge. Her glare spoke volumes. She believed she had the upper hand, that her authority was unquestionable. The enforcer in crimson leaned slightly forward, reinforcing the intimidation, while the clipboard queen shifted her papers, sensing a subtle crack in the balance. From the corner of the yard, the conflicted witness lingered, nervously gripping the edge of the fence. She had been silent for weeks, hesitant to challenge Heather Whitmore, hesitant to disrupt the established hierarchy. Now, with the calm authority I projected, she took a cautious step forward, her eyes meeting mine for a brief instant. That small, almost imperceptible gesture marked the turning point, the spark of courage amidst fear. Heather Whitmore, sensing a shift, raised her voice. "You can't just decide what's acceptable. This neighborhood has rules," the board chair said, her tone carrying a mixture of indignation and urgency. The enforcer in crimson gestured toward the speed bumps, a silent accusation. The tyrant in heels tapped her heel impatiently, and the officer of rules adjusted her pen, ready to confirm any violation. I stepped closer, my voice calm but deliberate. "Every measure here follows local regulations and HOA guidelines. The speed bumps ensure safety, not defiance. You may enforce rules, but you cannot ignore legality." My words hung in the air, precise and unflinching. The clipboard queen's hand froze mid-air, a subtle betrayal of doubt. The enforcer in crimson's frown deepened, and the tyrant in heels shifted weight, realizing her intimidation tactics carried less weight than before. The conflicted witness's eyes flickered, and she spoke softly but clearly, stepping forward. "I've seen how the board operates, sometimes bending rules for personal gain," she admitted, voice quivering but resolute. Heather Whitmore's expression faltered, the board chair visibly startled. The enforcer in crimson's shoulders stiffened. The clipboard queen's papers wavered in her grip, and the officer of rules paused, pen hovering mid-note. Neighbors began murmuring, a ripple of recognition spreading through the group. The small acts of defiance, the courage of one voice, gave strength to the others. Heather Whitmore, the enforcer in crimson, the clipboard queen, the tyrant in heels, and the officer of rules, all now faced an unexpected challenge, a quiet, methodical opposition backed by evidence and the awakening support of the neighborhood. The tension was electric, every gaze sharp, every movement intentional. The conflicted witness's confession had shifted the dynamic. Heather Whitmore's control wavered as her authority collided with logic, legality, and communal support. Her presence, once intimidating, now seemed vulnerable in the face of unity and preparedness. I took a breath, feeling the neighborhood's energy shift. The battle was no longer just about the speed bumps. It was about procedural integrity, fairness, and the awakening of the community to a new possibility. The stage was set for a strategic confrontation, one that would test authority, courage, and the power of preparation. Heather Whitmore, the board chair, had underestimated the impact of calm determination and collective insight. The morning sun glinted off the freshly installed speed bumps, casting sharp shadows across the asphalt. Heather Whitmore, the board chair, stood at the end of the street, her hands clasped tightly over the clipboard, Queen's signature papers, a symbol of authority and intimidation. The enforcer in crimson flanked her, heels planted firmly, radiating confidence that belied a faint tremor in her expression. The tyrant in heels tapped impatiently on the curb, while the officer of rules adjusted her glasses, scanning every inch of the roadway for evidence of supposed violations. I watched from my porch, calm and deliberate, knowing every observer in the neighborhood had a clear view of our quiet standoff. The speed bumps were more than physical barriers. They were strategic anchors, symbols of my resolve and adherence to regulations. Heather Whitmore's glare swept across them, the board chair assessing with meticulous precision, but unable to challenge legality. Her eyes narrowed as the enforcer in crimson whispered something, clearly seeking confirmation, while the clipboard queen shuffled papers, her authority less commanding than moments ago. From the corner, the conflicted witness lingered, shifting weight from foot to foot. Her gaze darted between me and the board chair, reflecting the internal struggle that had plagued her for weeks. Now, emboldened by the subtle cracks in Heather Whitmore's composed facade, she approached hesitantly, voice soft but firm. "I've seen how she manipulates the rules. For personal gain," she admitted, eyes fixed on the enforcer in crimson, who visibly stiffened. The tyrant in heels' jaw tightened. The officer of rules' pen froze mid-note, and the clipboard queen's papers fluttered in her grasp. Heather Whitmore, sensing the growing momentum against her, stepped forward. "You've ignored clear guidelines, and this neighborhood cannot tolerate it," the board chair proclaimed, voice ringing with authority, yet tinged with frustration. The enforcer in crimson leaned closer, nodding subtly, a silent attempt to reinforce the threat. The clipboard queen tapped a pen against the folder, the tyrant in heels' stance rigid, projecting defiance. The officer of rules adjusted her posture, as if the weight of expectation alone could maintain control. I raised a hand, signaling calm, my voice carrying across the street. "Everything here complies with municipal codes and HOA regulations. The speed bumps were installed to ensure safety, not to defy authority. Every step we've taken is documented, every measure lawful." My words carried a precision honed by years of procedural expertise, slicing through the board chair's bravado. Heather Whitmore's eyes flickered. The enforcer in crimson glanced sideways. The clipboard queen's hands faltered, and the tyrant in heels hesitated. The conflicted witness took another step forward, visibly gathering courage. "The reports, the fines, the selective enforcement, it's all documented. The neighborhood deserves transparency," she said, voice resonant with newfound strength. Heather Whitmore's gaze sharpened, but the cracks in her authoritative veneer widened. The board chair's posture faltered slightly. The enforcer in crimson's confidence wavered, and the officer of rules seemed momentarily uncertain, pen poised but idle. Neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the subtle shift in tension. Murmurs spread like wildfire, collective acknowledgement of fairness, law, and strategic foresight. The speed bumps became a visual testament not of defiance, but of reasoned, lawful action. Heather Whitmore, the enforcer in crimson, the clipboard queen, the tyrant in heels, and the officer of rules all confronted a new dynamic: authority confronted by legitimacy, intimidation meeting procedural clarity, fear meeting strategic preparation. I breathed slowly, sensing the pivot point. The stage was set. The battle for compliance, transparency, and community trust was no longer theoretical. It was happening in real time, with every resident witnessing the subtle but undeniable shift in power. Heather Whitmore's hold on the narrative was loosening, her reputation facing the undeniable weight of fairness, legality, and neighborhood solidarity. The afternoon sun glared down on the quiet suburban street, catching the edges of the freshly installed speed bumps. Heather Whitmore, the board chair, stood near the corner, her clipboard queen persona fully engaged. Notes shuffled and pointed directly at me. The enforcer in crimson stepped forward, heels digging into the asphalt, projecting authority that only hinted at uncertainty beneath. The tyrant in heels tapped her foot rhythmically, impatience radiating, while the officer of rules adjusted her stance, as if sheer posture could lend credence to the impending confrontation. From my vantage point, I observed the subtle cracks forming in Heather Whitmore's armor. The board chair's eyes darted between the street and the neighbors now gathering on their lawns. The enforcer in crimson whispered something under her breath, almost involuntarily revealing concern, while the clipboard queen's papers trembled slightly in her hands. The tyrant in heels narrowed her gaze, trying to suppress a flicker of doubt. Even the officer of rules paused, her pen hovering midair, betraying uncertainty. The conflicted witness emerged from the crowd, shoulders stiff but determined. Her eyes met mine, and a small nod signaled allegiance, though the tension of choosing sides weighed heavily on her. "I've been watching how she bends the rules. Selectively," she admitted quietly. The board chair stiffened. The enforcer in crimson exchanged a glance with her. The clipboard queen's lips pursed, and the tyrant in heels' fists tightened at her sides. The officer of rules scribbled nothing, pensiveness replacing the usual dogged vigilance. Heather Whitmore, sensing the shift, straightened to full height. "This is an affront to our authority. You've disrupted the order we've maintained for years." The board chair's voice rang with forced conviction. The enforcer in crimson leaned slightly closer, nodding, attempting to reinforce her partner's threat. The clipboard queen shuffled her notes. The tyrant in heels tapped impatiently, and the officer of rules maintained her cold, scrutinizing stare, though tension etched her brow. I stepped forward onto the street, hands visible, calm but commanding. "Every step here follows the municipal code and HOA regulations," I declared. "The speed bumps ensure safety, not defiance. Documentation proves that every installation was proper, every step legally compliant." My words were deliberate, surgical, each one aimed at exposing the facade behind the authority. Heather Whitmore's eyes flickered. The enforcer in crimson glanced aside nervously. The clipboard queen's notes slipped slightly from trembling hands, and the tyrant in heels stiffened, momentarily disarmed. The conflicted witness moved closer to the board chair, her voice gaining strength. "There's a pattern. Fines issued without quorum, selective enforcement, personal interest masked as regulation. The residents deserve transparency," she said. Heather Whitmore's face hardened, but the cracks in the enforcer in crimson's composure widened. The clipboard queen's hand shook. The tyrant in heels' expression betrayed unease, and the officer of rules paused mid-inspection, pen hovering uselessly over the air. Curious neighbors spilled onto sidewalks, drawn by the tension, their murmurs forming a chorus of quiet support. The speed bumps, once mere deterrents, became symbols of lawful preparation and strategic foresight. Heather Whitmore's authority, the enforcer in crimson's projected certainty, the clipboard queen's meticulous notes, the tyrant in heels' rigid stance, and the officer of rules' scrutinizing gaze, all confronted a growing reality. The collective will of the community, grounded in law and reason, outweighed intimidation. I inhaled deeply, feeling the pivot shift under the sun's glare. The stage was ready. The preparation was complete. Every observer, every resident, every watchful eye bore witness to the subtle dismantling of command through strategy, patience, and lawful persistence. Heather Whitmore, the board chair, realized the neighborhood was no longer a silent audience. Her grip on the narrative, though still outwardly firm, had begun to unravel under the weight of evidence, unity, and resolve. The evening air was thick with anticipation as neighbors gathered near the newly marked street. Heather Whitmore, the board chair, arrived first, her presence commanding immediate attention. The enforcer in crimson followed closely, heels clicking on the asphalt with exaggerated authority. The clipboard queen clutched her papers tightly, as if they could serve as armor. The tyrant in heels scanned the gathering crowd, scanning for weakness, while the officer of rules positioned herself near the curb, her posture rigid, vigilant, and unyielding. I stood at the center of the street, the speed bumps gleaming under the fading sunlight. Every inch had been measured, every slope double-checked. The tactical advantage was mine, though nothing. In this battle relied on brute force. It was strategy, precision, and the weight of law. The board chair's eyes narrowed at the sight of residents peering from porches and lawns, whispering among themselves. The enforcer in crimson shifted slightly, a subtle crack in her confidence betraying the veneer of control. The clipboard queen flipped a page nervously. The tyrant in heels pursed her lips, and the officer of rules' pen hovered midair, uncertain. Whispers traveled through the crowd, neighbors exchanging glances, some emboldened, others cautious. I moved deliberately to a central position, my hands open, palms visible, a gesture of calm and control. This installation adheres to every municipal code and HOA bylaw, I announced. The board chair's eyes widened minutely. The enforcer in crimson's jaw tightened. The clipboard queen's hand shook, and the tyrant in heels' stance faltered just slightly. Even the officer of rules seemed to hesitate, reconsidering the rigidity she had maintained all day. The conflicted witness stepped forward, her voice clear, shaking off hesitation. Fines have been issued without quorum, violations enforced selectively. Residents deserve accountability, she declared. Heather Whitmore's expression hardened, yet her aura of unshakable authority wavered as murmurs of agreement spread among the crowd. The board chair's glare intensified, but unease flickered behind it. The enforcer in crimson exchanged a quick, tense glance with her superior. The clipboard queen's grip on her notes loosened, the tyrant in heels' shoulders tensed, and the officer of rules' pen began to tremble. I gestured toward the speed bumps, each one a testament to preparation and foresight. These are lawful installations. Every measure, every placement, documented and approved. They ensure safety, not rebellion, I stated firmly. The crowd responded with subtle nods, and the first murmurs of support became audible. Heather Whitmore, the board chair, attempted to speak, but her voice was overshadowed by the swelling community consensus. The enforcer in crimson faltered mid-step. The clipboard queen's papers slipped from her hands. The tyrant in heels' glare wavered, and the officer of rules adjusted her stance, no longer entirely certain of her authority. I took a deep breath, feeling the tide shift. The strategy had succeeded. The evidence, the measured actions, and the visible support of the neighborhood had altered the balance of power. The board chair, once untouchable, now faced a visible fracture in control. The enforcer in crimson's rigid obedience was tempered by doubt. The clipboard queen's meticulous veneer had cracked. The tyrant in heels' confidence had been punctured, and the officer of rules, for the first time, questioned the legitimacy of her unwavering stance. Neighbors began to step closer, confident, empowered. The scene was no longer simply a confrontation between one homeowner and the HOA president. It had evolved into a demonstration of collective resolve, strategic mastery, and lawful perseverance. Every element, speed bumps, positioning, witnesses, and community presence, worked in concert. Heather Whitmore, the board chair, sensed it. Her unilateral command could no longer dominate the narrative. The battle lines had been drawn, and the final showdown loomed with precision, law, and community unity. The day of the public confrontation arrived, the neighborhood park transformed into a makeshift forum. Heather Whitmore, the board chair, arrived early, her sharp heels clicking against the concrete, the enforcer in crimson shadowing her every move. The clipboard queen fumbled with papers as she attempted to maintain composure. The tyrant in heels kept her posture impeccable but rigid, and the officer of rules stationed herself near the entrance, scanning for dissenters. Every alias, every angle, radiated control, but tension had begun to crack their armor. I stepped forward, the crowd of neighbors behind me, a sea of expectant faces unified by weeks of planning. The speed bumps and strategic placements in front of us were no longer just road installations. They were symbols of measured resistance, proof of foresight, and subtle power. The board chair's gaze swept the assembly, trying to reassert dominance. The enforcer in crimson whispered instructions to the clipboard queen, whose papers trembled in her hands. The tyrant in heels' glare sought to intimidate, while the officer of rules made notes furiously, unsure which enforcement would hold. I began to speak, my voice steady, resonating through the park. Today is not about rebellion, I declared, but about ensuring fairness, accountability, and the lawful application of rules. Heather Whitmore's lips pressed into a thin line, the board chair's aura of control momentarily unsettled. The enforcer in crimson's shoulders stiffened, the clipboard queen's hands tightened on her notes. The tyrant in heels' stance faltered, and the officer of rules' pen hovered midair, betraying uncertainty. One by one, I presented the evidence. Violation notices issued arbitrarily, bylaws amended without quorum, and financial discrepancies that favored personal interests. The community listened, some nodding, others whispering in agreement. Heather Whitmore, the board chair, attempted to interrupt, but the murmurs of support for procedural integrity drowned out her voice. The enforcer in Crimson's rigid obedience wavered under the scrutiny of witnesses. The clipboard queen's meticulous facade cracked. The tyrant in heel's authority faltered, and the officer of rules hesitated at every note, doubting the legitimacy of her prior assertions. I gestured toward the crowd, emphasizing the unity that had grown over weeks of quiet strategizing. These signatures, these statements, these actions reflect the will of the community, not one person's whim, I continued. The board chair's face tightened with frustration. The enforcer in crimson exchanged a tense glance with her. The clipboard queen shuffled papers nervously. The tyrant in heel's posture grew rigid but fragile, and the officer of rules' pen hovered, indecision apparent to all. Then, the conflicted witness stepped forward, offering testimony that confirmed the violations and mismanagement. The murmurs became louder, the collective awareness undeniable. Heather Whitmore, the board chair, realized the scale of opposition she now faced. The enforcer in Crimson's confidence faltered. The clipboard queen could no longer maintain pretense. The tyrant in heel's intimidation failed to sway the crowd, and the officer of rules visibly questioned her adherence to flawed directives. The momentum shifted. Residents began to voice support for lawful accountability, signing petitions and confirming procedural irregularities. The board chair's glare softened, replaced with unease. The enforcer in Crimson's stance relaxed slightly. The clipboard queen's papers slipped from nervous hands. The tyrant in heel's authority diminished visibly, and the officer of rules' posture betrayed uncertainty. Every strategic preparation had coalesced into a public reckoning, a community asserting its rights. As the meeting concluded, it was clear. The tide had turned. Heather Whitmore, the board chair, and her cadre were no longer the arbiters of unilateral power. The collective will of the neighborhood, the evidence, and the strategic orchestration of lawful actions had shifted control. The confrontation had not ended in chaos. It ended in clarity, lawfulness, and empowerment. The neighborhood exhaled as the formal proceedings concluded. Heather Whitmore, the board chair, stood rigid at the edge of the crowd, the enforcer in crimson slightly behind her, eyes darting for support that wasn't coming. The clipboard queen clutched her papers tightly, the tyrant in heel's composure faltering under the weight of collective disapproval, and the officer of rules slowly lowered her pen, a reluctant acknowledgement of miscalculation. Every alias and every stance that once conveyed unquestionable authority now trembled under the clarity of transparency and lawful action. I stepped forward, letting the atmosphere settle, feeling the pulse of the neighborhood in sync with mine. The speed bumps, the documented violations, and the evidence laid bare had not only exposed the absurd overreach, but also reinforced the principle that order without accountability is chaos masquerading as governance. The board chair's rigid expression hinted at disbelief. The enforcer in crimson's face betrayed reluctant acceptance. The clipboard queen's trembling hands revealed internal conflict. The tyrant in heel's intimidating aura faded, and the officer of rules' gaze shifted toward the floor, defeated but intact. Residents came forward, one by one, offering affirmations of community solidarity and validation of procedural fairness. "This is what we were missing," a neighbor whispered, glancing at Heather Whitmore, the board chair, who now realized that her influence had eroded. The enforcer in crimson tried to interject, but found her voice lost among the collective support for lawful conduct. The clipboard queen shuffled her papers, unsure how to respond. The tyrant in heel's posture softened under scrutiny, and the officer of rules' pen remained idle, symbolizing a quiet surrender to the truth. I addressed the crowd, my voice calm but resonant. We have achieved more than just compliance today. We have reclaimed accountability, fairness, and the right to enjoy our neighborhood without arbitrary interference. The board chair, Heather Whitmore, shifted uneasily. The enforcer in crimson's shoulders slumped slightly. The clipboard queen's gaze met the ground. The tyrant in heel's intimidation dissipated, and the officer of rules blinked, the weight of collective judgment settling in. The signatures gathered, the evidence cataloged, and the community's unity had ensured that the recall vote would be decisive. The board chair's power, once unquestioned, had been checked not with confrontation alone, but with strategy, precision, and lawful adherence. The enforcer in crimson, the clipboard queen, the tyrant in heels, and the officer of rules could no longer claim authority over a community that had learned its strength through procedure and solidarity. As neighbors mingled, a sense of relief and empowerment spread. Heather Whitmore, the board chair, lingered near the fringes, the enforcer in crimson flanking her uncertainly, the clipboard queen nervously folding papers she no longer needed. The tyrant in heels' once imposing presence diminished, and the officer of rules exhaled, released from the tension of misplaced enforcement. The speed bumps, once instruments of strategy, now symbolized more: foresight, courage, and the collective assertion of community rights. I reflected on the journey, the minor confrontations that escalated, the alliances quietly built, the careful study of rules, and the eventual public reckoning. The lessons were clear. Leadership is not measured by the power to control, but by the ability to unite, protect, and follow lawful process. The board chair, Heather Whitmore, and her cohort had underestimated the community's resolve, and in doing so, they had handed over authority to fairness and accountability. The neighborhood would never forget the day that law, strategy, and unity prevailed. The barbecues could return, the air could carry the scent of hickory without fear, and each resident knew that vigilance, planning, and moral clarity were the ultimate safeguards. If you want more stories of homeowners standing up to HOA tyranny, hit subscribe right now, share your story in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from.